actions to achieve GHG emissions reductions targets. And again, that's going to be led by David Reed of Lanark, and who you've met before, at least virtually, and then Duncan Cavins of C2MP, who you've also met virtually before. I think I'm going to turn it over to David just briefly, just to give an overview of today's agenda, and then I think he's going to pass it back to Lisa just to give us a little bit of a brief on what phase 2 of Reimagine includes and where we're going from here. So thank you. That's all I had to add.
Thanks very much. And I did hear an echo there. Maybe if I ask people to close their mics, we'll manage that. Sounds better. And I'll let you tell me if you're not hearing me correctly. It's a pleasure to be here again. We were last here, it's hard to remember, but it was in October 10th, and gave quite a broad presentation on both greenhouse gases and the environment. And so this is to go in more depth. Excuse me for a moment while I switch.
David, are you able to speak more closely to
your microphone? Oh, okay. I know what's happened. Okay. Yeah, I just switched sound just before the presentation to try and get a video to work. Sorry. I will speak up. So we're going to focus today on climate action. We are looking to focus the next meeting on other aspects of the environment. That will be coming up, I understand it's early September. We wanted to have enough time today to go into depth on greenhouse gases and allow discussion among the committee and not be rushed. So this is the agenda. The first 15 minutes are just giving some processing context and update on what's going on with the overall Imagine the Mammal process. The great bulk of today is with Duncan on greenhouse gas action and emerging options and your discussion around that. And then the final 15 minutes are next step, getting ready for the follow-on on climate resilience and general environment emerging options, which is coming in this meeting. I'd like to ask Lisa to, I'll change slides, but to make a few comments on the overall Reimagine the Mammal process. Lisa.
Good afternoon, everyone. How committed you all are to be here on a sunny afternoon. So on Monday, Council got an update, and you're going to get a portion of that on phase 2 exploring options. And we launched on the 28th a survey on the draft foundations, which is the Nanaimo donut, also the different indicators and targets that you also supported us with, and the overall goals. And the important thing that we did this Monday is we launched an opportunity for people to give feedback on 3 different land use scenarios. So we're in the thick of phase 2, which is exploring options and going out to the community and yourselves as a committee and saying, okay, how do we move forward with the different objectives that we have for climate change, population growth, and what are the different ways of doing this in terms of land use? And what we're doing here today with you is Dave's leading you through some of the pieces that are land use, and then also beyond that, policy that influence different aspects of climate change. So after we're through this phase, all of that information that we get from yourselves and the public and different interest groups and stakeholders and government partners will then be used to put together a draft phase 3 plan and another opportunity to give feedback. If I could go to the next slide, Dave. So our intended outcome and one of the objectives of this process was to take several plans that needed to be updated and integrate them into one overall city plan. And here's a visual graphic of where we think we're heading. So we have our overall official community plan. We've got the Parks, Recreation and Culture Plan, the Climate Action Plan, Active Transportation Plan, and looking at integrating and coordinating policies that currently overlap in all of these plans and integrating them in such a way that they work better together, that we have a more effective way of implementing the goals of those different, that integration. And then supporting those are key strategy documents like the economic development plan, water supply strategy, and then implementation plans that will help us actualize or realize the vision in that overall integrated plan. And then we also have, as part of that, focus area plans like neighborhood plans sitting there. So this is where we think we're heading in phase 3 with a draft document. And what you'll be doing is helping us with some of the wording to go into that overall integrated plan that you see there with the different components. And so what Dave and Duncan will be leading you through is some emerging options that they'd like your feedback on. And so with that, Dave, I don't know if you'd like to go through the actual scenarios as they relate to the GHG pieces. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Yes, there are 3 scenarios, and as Lisa mentioned, just on Monday, there is in the Imagine Nanaimo website, there are these 3 scenarios presented, and there are videos for each of them that are about 3.5 minutes long. I wanted to show you those today, but unfortunately Zoom doesn't want to play the sound on the videos. I can show you the videos, but you can't hear the narrative, so I'd encourage you to go to the site. And originally we were going to show slides of the scenarios, and I will do that now instead of the video. There are 3 scenarios, and the small icon representatives here are important for general understanding. Scenario 1 is this current path. It reflects in concept what's in the existing official community plan as well as companion documents. And so the red dots are mobility and concentrated nodes. So they are downtown, of course, but also BIU, the hospital, Woodgrove, and a proposed new node at Sandstone. You will hear us changing from the word urban node to town centers based on a discussion with council, but those were nodes in the existing OCP. In scenario 2, it's similar, except there's a change, in addition of mobility hubs that add Country Club and the Nanaimo North Town Center, and moving the Sandstone node to actually Chase River. And then finally, scenario 3, the central focus, looks at concentrating growth in urban nodes in the downtown BIU and hospital central area, and having smaller nodes at Woodgrove and Chase River. Those are the big differences, but there are many more subtle differences. These were the videos. Unfortunately, I have to go buy them, but do look at them online. They'll be great reminders. And so here is the more detailed maps that go with current path first, and then which is scenario 1 and then 2 and 3. So you can see the complexity in this. It's a similar complexity to the existing OCP. An official community plan has to show land use designations and include mobility linkages, as well as key parks and environmental and other features. So this is very close to the existing OCP. You can see the red, which is the urban nodes that I mentioned. So downtown, BIU, hospital, Woodgrove, and a new one at Sandstone. There is, in the existing OCP, corridors, urban corridors, and they're shown, which is generally along the arterial roads. And those are existing policy and starting to be built out. It's pretty successful, some of those, and they are carried forward here. And then the balance is neighborhoods, which are the slightly lower density residential neighborhoods. There are nuances here around where industrial is handled in the scenarios. In this one, current policy is that new industrial would be at Sandstone near the existing solid waste site. And in this one, Ocean View, which is out by Dew Point, was a resort designation. And so that goes forward. There is more detail, but that's general highlights. Scenario 2, in terms of mobility hubs, looks at the urban nodes being downtown, BIU, hospital, as well as Wood Grove. It adds Nanaimo North as an urban node, and it adds Country Club as an urban node. Partly that's because they're shown as mobility hubs in city policy related to transit and active transportation. They were a commercial designation in the existing NCP, and so it's an encouragement for them to be more mixed use and even more so walkable, bikeable community. There is a change in this as well. The new Sandstone urban node is actually moved to be at the existing and adjacent Chase River area, so it's a bit closer into town. And as a part of that, then the Sandstone area around the landfill is changed to more an industrial or regional commercial center. Certainly some residential uses, but mostly regional service and commercial uses. And also significantly in this one, the Ocean View area is changed from resort designation to partly an area that is light industrial, like warehousing and that sort of thing, close to Deep Point. And the lower part of it is suggested to be perhaps regional park, below Ghg Reduction. And again, there are other nuances, but those are the highlights. And finally, scenario 3, the central focus, looks at a what if, and these are all what ifs. What if we concentrated growth downtown, interchange area, and DIU, and the infill areas in between. So looking at a high density in those urban nodes, but moderate density in the rest of the central core, with an emphasis of transportation infrastructure, active transportation, and the like in that area. So a more urbanized central core, certainly not all high rise, lots of low rise and lots of existing housing, but a more concentrated mix. With a recognition that there would be still some mixed use at Wood Grove and some at Chase River, but not as intense as in the central area. And that means then that there is less change in the other neighborhoods. There is still corridors and a lot of change along the arterial routes, but just trying to look at what if we tried to concentrate growth. There are some subtleties in the Sandstone area, a bit more of a mix between residential and commercial and the like, and this is the same that we should do with the split between light industrial and commercial part growth. So that's Duncan's going to refer to the scenarios as he does his evaluation of greenhouse gases, so that's an introduction to what they are. I might stop for questions and additional comments from Lisa. Probably you can add. Thanks.
Dave, I just want to, through the chair, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I don't know if others can't hear you very well. So I'm just wondering if you could speak closest to the mic, and there's a little background crackling when you speak. So
I will fix that. As Duncan presents, I will fix that.
Okay.
It's to do with my setup. And
thank you.
Duncan, I'd like to introduce you. This is Duncan Cavins from C2MP. Would you like to carry on? You must be on mute.
How is my sound as opposed to Dave's sound?
Excellent.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the GHG reduction options that we have, and I really want to start having a bit of a discussion with you to really understand where there's lots of options, and I want to kind of I'm really trying to get a sense of where Nanaimo wants to be on its greenhouse gas policies. While we're talking about the scenarios, there's good news and there's bad news about the scenarios. The good news is all three of the scenarios do push you in a direction towards a reduction in GHGs over time, over the time horizon of the OCP. And the good news is also is that as I've looked at it, and I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail as we go, that there's not a huge difference from my perspective in terms of what the differences between the three scenarios are going to be. So there are other reasons to choose between the three scenarios, but I wouldn't focus on GHGs on that. The bad news is none of the three are likely to, just on their own, get you to your targets for GHG reductions, which probably isn't surprising for you on the Environment Committee to know that. There is no real silver bullet. But just wanted to say that. So that, we're going to talk about the three scenarios a little bit, but what we're really looking at now is what are the policies that fill in the details and fill in the requirements that you guys are going to use to meet your targets that complement the OCP scenarios and the OCP development. Next slide. So just I'm going to do a bit of a reminder, first of all, about what we're talking about. This is a little bit of a repeat of what we talked about in October, but just to get everybody back on the same page. We are going to have a bunch of stops in the way here to actually have some discussion, because I really want to hear there's choices that we can make, and I really want to hear those choices. But first, I'm going to start off with a few minutes of just reminding you. So in April 2019, if I got the date right, the NIMO committed to, yes, it's down at the bottom there, has committed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from 2010 to 2030. It's 2021 right now. To reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from 94 to 107%. You guys did implement a range. I'm just picking the bottom of them because either of them are going to be hard, but we're just picking that. At the same time, just to compare that, next slide, David, BC has made similar commitments to reduce greenhouse gases by 40% from 2007 by 2030 and 80% from 2007 by 2050. Note the starting date just before an economic reduction, and note that your emissions targets are less than BC. So go to the next slide. And I just wanted to highlight that you have far more ambitious targets in the province. You have picked a year where emissions were already down quite a bit from 2007 to 2010, and you have more ambitious targets. At the same time, you also have far fewer resources in terms of taxation ability and legislative powers. And BC has come up with their Clean BC plan and still has a 25% gap of how they're going to get to those targets. So I just want to emphasize that this is hard. And is likely going to be difficult to do. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. You guys all know the IPCC reports and what our requirements, the heat wave that just happened, the fires that are burning in the interior right now. We know we have to meet these targets, but I want to emphasize that this is a difficult task. And it's going to require both changes in policy, but also investments either from you as a city, but also from you as a community.
Duncan?
Yeah?
Are you, would you like, there's one of the community members has got a question. Do you want to entertain questions throughout or wait till you're done?
At this point, I think questions of clarification, and then in about 5 minutes, we're going to have a bit of a discussion. So that Great. Can bring bigger questions out. If there's a question of clarification, for sure.
Jerome, do you got a question of clarification?
It can wait. There's a question for David before we started, so that's fine.
Okay,
we
sorry
can come back to it
about that.
after.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
Great. Next slide. So this again is a reminder that are looking at the current policies that we see in from the federal and the provincial government that have been legislated, not ones that have been announced. I make a distinction there. That our modeling does show a reduction in GHG emissions by 2050, but not enough to meet even your 2030 target, let alone your 2050 target. The bulk of the reductions will be coming from transportation, and that's due to fuel efficiency standards increasing over time for vehicles, and also wholesale electrification of the vehicle fleet, which has been mandated by the province. Next slide. So this is what I really want to focus the discussion on today. This is the big picture discussion. And I really want to know how aggressive does NIMO want its GHG's policies to be? And as we go through buildings and transportation and solid waste in the rest of the discussion here, I'm going to frame it using these. And I want to say that, these are the levels of policy that we can look at. And so we have the current policies, what you're currently doing, that are fully within your powers, are relatively inexpensive, but still better than policies that are being implemented in the rest of Canada. I'm saying that it's, they're within kind of the norm of British Columbia, which is way out ahead of prairies and even Ontario and the East Coast. But I want to emphasize, even when I say current and it's low, we're still pushing the boundaries nationally. But also unlikely to meet your GHG targets without the province and the feds really stepping up. Moderate pushes current policy, not necessarily within the powers of municipalities. There's workarounds, I can talk about that in detail, that have some cost and increases your chance of meeting the target. Fully meeting them remains unlikely. Or aggressive, where we start having assertive demands on residents and businesses, requiring them to upgrade buildings, spend their own money on it, spend the money of the city on it, pushing the boundary of what your traditional municipal powers are, looking at high initial costs, and have a better chance to meet targets, but will still require federal and provincial action to work together. And you'll note that there's an arrow past the aggressive. And I'm going to frame a lot of these discussions in kind of what are the aggressive things that are being done in British Columbia and Canada. But there are things that are being done in other parts of the world, whether it be Berkeley, California, banning natural gas in new construction, whether it be things that are, whole new communities being designed in the Netherlands that are car-free and fully carbon neutral that are being planned right now as we speak to start construction in the next year or two. There is a line beyond that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be doing an analysis of various policies, but it really helps me to know what the framing is and where you guys want to be. All of these, for the councils in the committee, the farther you get out to the right, the more of a political risk you have, the more costs you have, but also the better chances of meeting your targets. So I wanted to stop here and just have and let the members of the committee kind of express, where they think we should be. And then we'll move on to much more detailed. So this is more of a high level discussion here, and we're going to move into buildings and transportation and solid waste as we get in a few more minutes. But I just wanted to get your first gut reactions at this point.
Great. We'll start off with Jerome, and maybe you can get clarification on your question there to David, and then if you have another comment, go ahead.
Thanks. David, the question I had for you was, I'm assuming that the three options that are presented, especially 2 and 3, because I can't quite remember the nodes and the other ones, not the nodes, whatever they're called, hubs. Those are presumably set up or they're projecting the growth of Nanaimo, and that therefore, if you go in one of the 2 plans or either plan, you are, basically able to accommodate the projected growth of the region. Is this right?
That is correct. The idea is that any one of those scenarios would meet the growth needs of Nanaimo and in fact would want to meet the broader objectives that the public and yourselves have set out. So they are all quantified to be realistic. Right.
So then to link up to Duncan's presentation, which one of the 2 scenarios, or maybe there's a 4th one, beyond the status quo scenario, how do they have an effect on whether we end up with moderate or aggressive reductions in GHGs that might just be tied to transportation? I'm assuming that new buildings will be according to the code, so there's no necessarily major gains to be made there. But in terms of transportation or other greenhouse gas sources, which one of these scenarios gets us where on the spectrum?
So I'm going to talk about that in more detail as we go. But I think that the main message I want to get out of this is you can't grow your way to those scale of reductions because of the existing land use patterns that you have. So there are some slight differences between 2 and 3 that make it easier on the transportation, but you're still not going to get an aggressive reduction just by doing a land use change. There's a lot of other things that have to happen to get there. And you could argue that scenario 1, the current OCP, sets you up on a pretty good path comparatively to get there as well. It's the rest of the policies that need to get integrated and get pushed along that are going to move you towards a higher path. I would argue that all 3 of them, without a complementary set of policies, are going to get you somewhere in the current to moderate level.
So they're all effectively status quo from the greenhouse gas emission standpoint, in the most basic level. Unless, so like,
I wouldn't say status quo. I would say that they're moving in a way, but they're not looking at things like car-free areas. They're
Right.
not looking at that. Like that's maybe that's status quo in terms of that. But they're definitely moving in a better direction. Yeah, they're not radical. Let's put it that way.
So then I can't help feel that why are we looking at 3 options of land use plans, knowing that none of them, radically get us to where we might want to be, yet those are the 3 things in front of us.
I want to be clear. In order to get that from a land use perspective only, you're going to be looking at removing existing neighborhoods. There's a level of things that you're going to need to get to. So we're because you can't grow if every net new person coming on has net zero, you still have all the existing neighborhoods that aren't. So that's the conflict here.
Right.
In other words, no land use and mobility plan will meet your targets on its own. It's that plus other actions that are taken. Land use is an important part of it, but there's a misconception that it somehow will solve the greenhouse gas problem. It won't. There are other things that have to be done.
So I'm going to stop talking because I think there's other hands, but are those other things going to be discussed later?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. Elise.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Roger.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations and being here. I have feeding off of Jerome's questions and comments, I'm just wondering, who is defining the word radical? And then I know that, or if I heard correctly, David, you kind of said the term mixed use a bit, but I didn't quite visually comprehend that within the 3 examples. My basic knowledge of land use and planning, I understand that mixed use is a good thing on the topic of what we're talking about. So maybe just understanding that a bit better within the 3 models. If you could speak to those to start with. Thank you.
Thank you. We are working on some visualizations around, what would be an idealized urban node or neighborhood, and those are to come as a part of the process. We're working on those over the next few weeks, so I would anticipate by our next meeting that we will likely be able to share those with this meeting. It's helpful. Certainly there is, just as land use is only a part of the solution of a both sustainable and economically attractive city, there are a lot of other factors as well that go into mixing land use and proper mobility and proper environmental and urban forest and all the things we want to talk about next meeting are a part of the details that would want to be addressed. There is a general recognition that the 3 scenarios are about land use. There are a lot of other strategies, and the greenhouse gas strategy that Duncan is going to present here is one of them. A lot of other strategies complement the land use scenarios. So there are 2 major elements. There's optional scenarios, and then there's other strategies that are common to all the scenarios. And we'll be talking about both of those.
Okay, so maybe just to the presentation to proceed, but is it possible that there might be more than 3 scenarios for land use? Understanding that there's multiple things at play beyond that.
There are 3 that are before the public right now, but the intent is to listen to what comes from the public and committee and stakeholders, and absolutely that might lead to different mixes or additional scenarios. Yes, that's the point of the process.
Okay.
I think it's worth pointing out the idea was not to pick one. The idea was to use them to explore what they could mean, and if we need another one that has elements of some of them and stuff that's not in any of them, that would be okay too. The idea is not It's not like pick 1, 2, or 3.
And then the second part, Duncan asked how aggressive we want to go. Is this the right time to speak to that, or should we wait? Yeah, okay. I personally vie for being aggressive, especially given how you preface this conversation, Duncan, with all 3 of them not really reaching the goals. I think that we have to be bold, and if we're not going to be the ones to challenge it and to set an example, then who else are we to rely on to do that? So I definitely advocate for the most aggressive plan that you think is appropriate for the city of Nanaimo.
Thank you, Elise. Tyler, I saw your hand up there and then it went down. Are you still looking to make a comment?
I'll comment after Wally, thanks.
Okay, go ahead, Wally.
I'm just wondering, in light of what's going on in the last 18 months, to what degree you've played the what-if scenario. There has been a lot of coverage right across North America, people abandoning cities, a huge increase in prices of single-family dwellings, people wanting to stay away from densification. There seems to be some major trends in it. There's certainly been some programs both in Canada and the States of people getting out of large cities and going to smaller ones or going to smaller communities. And I'm just wondering if you played the what-if game, or if there is a fourth scenario, or if we're all read to any of all of those 3 of what if that trend continues on as opposed to not our traditional land use planning.
I think that that trend is recognized in all the scenarios. There is an expectation, based on the prior studies on demographics and land availability. There is a review of the general trends and a range of the amount of growth that's allowed for. And so I think the estimates that are being allowed for here, it's about 21,000 units, are realistic. The pace of that will vary, as in it may be very rapid growth for a short period and then slow down and then be rapid again. Yeah, but when you look out over the 25 years, then that is a realistic expectation. And so the plan is to accommodate an enormous range of housing types and employment types, a range of demographics and people of all different types, so that there's a place for everyone in Nanaimo. And so it's not like there will only be high density areas. In fact, most of Nanaimo is relatively low density. And so that will still remain unless there is some movement to take some of that out. But the new growth, the prior studies suggest to us, is going to tend to skew towards multiple family and density because of cost and lifestyle. But then other families and others will move to fill the existing single family neighborhoods. So there'll always be quite a range of opportunity and housing type in all scenarios. And there may be a fourth scenario that changes that mix somewhat. But as Duncan will cover in the presentation that goes on, it's somewhat about where we live, but it's a lot about how we live and how we move that makes a difference on greenhouse gases.
Great, thank you. Tyler.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Duncan and David, for the presentation so far and discussion. On this particular item, there is judgment from certain people that keeps me up at night, and that's my 2-year-old and my 3-year-old. So without hesitation, I'm on the aggressive end of the spectrum, and to sort of build on Lisa's air quotations around radical there, paraphrase Howard Zinn, I start from the same position that the world is topsy-turvy and all things are wrong. And I think the radical position here is the current and the moderate. So any reasonable approach has to be on the aggressive end of the spectrum, because it's what is necessary to avoid terrible things. So to answer your question, Duncan, aggressive plus is where I stand.
Thank you, Tyler. And just to add a quick comment to that, I definitely think that we need to be making a full effort. And I also think there has been some comments, around radical and how the different scenarios are framed, and potentially as they're put out to the public, depending on how they're framed, will really would prime the perspective that people view them, and maybe a more adequate framing would be, status quo, moderate effort, and the best that we can do, which is still inadequate. So I think that some thought to that as well, because we're in a pretty critical time. Thank you. And go ahead there, Duncan.
Next slide. So just a quick reminder of what causes our emissions, and it's burning of fossil fuels. There's lots of boundaries and definitions for emissions. I'm using the simplest. I'm not using embodied emissions. I'm not using our consumption, which are all important things. Just getting the basic what we consume in Nanaimo down is going to be hard enough. So that's going to be starting the discussion. And I'm happy to go into that a little bit later or offline if people want to talk about it. There's lots of things on that, but I think we need to tackle this stuff first. So the main driver of the way that the province uses tells us to evaluate our emissions are of burning fossil fuels in gasoline and diesel for vehicles, and natural gas and oil for heating and hot water. That's the primary ones. And even if you include consumption-based embodied emissions, this still remains true. It obviously gets down a little lower because of those other emissions, but this still will be the driver. We're burning a lot of fuel just to move around and to heat our homes. Next slide. And so in that discussion, if you want to reduce your GHG emissions, this is sort of, fuel efficiency, energy use 101. Our emissions are based on the amount of energy we need, how much we're, moving around. A car uses a lot more energy than moving around a bicycle. Using on a semi-truck, uses more energy. But it also relates to how efficient we're using it, whether or not that motor that you're using is particularly efficient, whether or not your furnace is running at 99% efficiency or 300% efficiency if it's a heat pump, or 65% if it's an old oil furnace, multiplied by the type of fuel you're using. So different fuels have a thing. So in order to reduce our GHG emissions, we can tackle any of those three. We've had lots of experience over the years of trying to reduce things by efficiency. There's lots of research that say it doesn't work because you just end up using more because you're more efficient. There's lots of other ways, but anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about that in detail. But that's the main thing. It's the only way you can reduce your GHG emissions are reducing your demand, increasing your efficiency, and reducing the carbon intensity of fuel. Next slide. Again, a reminder that different fuels have radically different types of carbon emissions from different sources. And this is just looking at gasoline, heating oil, natural gas versus electricity here in BC Hydro. Again, there's lots of ways you can argue about BC Hydro. In the scientific literature, it's pretty well agree with BC Hydro's take that they are a very low form of energy and have the capacity to get lower over time, a lot easier than your typical homeowner would. Next slide. And a reminder, because I've said this before, renewables don't always reduce GHG emissions because of our access to low emission hydroelectricity. If the cables keep working, I'll sure heard the news that happened. The cables are bulging right now. But I think we can rely on the engineers at BC Hydro more than the average homeowner. And when you start putting in renewables, such as solar in particular, at a local scale, it's far more expensive than what BC Hydro can do and large utilities can do at utility scale. But it also doesn't reduce our emissions locally. It has other benefits, and we can go into that, but focusing on putting solar panels on public buildings and various things really isn't going to make much of a difference here. Next slide. So now we're going to move into a discussion around policy options around the big areas. And we're going to frame it in terms of that current, moderate, and aggressive. And I point taken that we could change the terminology on that, but that's how I want to frame it. So we're going to jump in. Just to remind everyone that we're looking at buildings. This is the relative amount, the top thing in the bar there. We're assuming that BC is committed that all new buildings that are built after 2032 are net zero. So in Nanaimo, 11% of buildings emissions we're estimating are going to be built between now and 2032 before that comes in. And that in 2050, 89% of those building GHG emissions are going to be from buildings that already exist now. Next slide. So this is kind of my take on the three scenarios, and that 2 and 3 have slightly higher density buildings of new construction. And this is a little bit of a function of the scale. I was given, I had to do it into 4 leaves, and 4 means we're going to meet everything. 3 is slightly better than 2. I would probably put current path at 2.5 leaves rather than 3. But we're more likely with this scenario of mobility hubs, when you do smaller buildings, we're going to see some benefits of having more wood buildings, shorter buildings that can have less embodied emissions. They're also in scenario 2, you're actually redeveloping existing buildings, so you don't have to retrofit them. That's a good thing. And scenario 3, from a buildings perspective, not from a transportation, has the highest density buildings. Probably have a lower demand on energy because they're higher density and lower unit sizes, but probably have higher embodied emissions because they're more likely to be concrete. Again, that can change with building code changes and mass timber construction, but as we currently see it, but again, these are minor variations between the 3. Next slide. So just a few thoughts on, on new construction. So we're expecting 10,000 new units before 2032, before the BC Building Code hits net zero. 85% plus are going to use natural gas currently. Maybe more are going to come in doing heat pumps because of the last heat wave. I know that there's been a lot of chatter about that, but generally 85% of the homes are still heated by natural gas. And right now, our step code in Nanaimo require about 10 to 30% more efficient than BC Building Code. All buildings being built now will need to be retrofitted by 2050 to help you reach your target. So my point would be, why wait? Because you're going to have to make them do it later, but you can do it now. Next slide. And so here we're talking about new construction. And again, it's important to remember, we're talking about 11% of your GHGs under business as usual by 2050. So this is one part, but we need to deal with the other 89%. We'll do that in a later slide. And so currently you guys are requiring step 2 or 3 for new construction for 2022. I think the plan is to keep increasing to 2032. What you're doing right now is pretty typical for small and medium-sized municipalities in BC. An alternative that others have done and started to doing are requiring low GHG, including an alternative pathway for GHGs, so that instead of reaching a very high, you give developers and builders a choice of either reading really high on the step code or going to low carbon, and that can just be electric heat pumps with a certain efficiency standard. Other municipalities, the capital region, are moving there. Victoria's moving there. Most of the municipalities in the Lower Mainland have done this already. Another one is simply to require low GHG construction for all new construction. Municipalities in the Lower Mainland are starting to do that already. They're basically saying that if you want to build a building, you either have to reach passive house for your new construction or do low carbon emissions. And I know West Vancouver introduced that in January for single family low density and had zero developer pushback. And I can get into why in a little while. Basically, what you're saying is passive house is expensive, doesn't necessarily get you to a low carbon. But if you do something that's cheap and known, heat pumps, electric induction stoves, that kind of thing, it's way cheaper to do that than to do step 5. Every developer will choose the low pathway. If you want to go beyond aggressive, you do things like Berkeley, which is banning the installation of natural gas and fossil fuels, which is difficult to do legally here in BC. So I wanted to stop here and say, again, are we all feeling that that's what we should be doing? We should be requiring our developers and builders to increase costs by, well, some debate how much of an increase of cost, but definitely going to higher steps will increase costs and reduce choice in terms of builders. That's a question. Where do we want to be on this for new construction?
Okay, any comments on this? Elise. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Elise.
Okay, I'll go on then, Jerome, I suppose. Thank you for the additional information, Duncan. I think I have to absorb this before I make a statement of where I stand. However, I'm just wondering what, like you mentioned how in the lower mainland, how they had boundaries as to what new properties built needed to have or not have. Can you speak to anything about like white roofs and like the effectiveness of those and like the costs of those for the albedo?
Those kind of things would have a pretty minor impact over the grand. Once you're moving up to step 5 and step 4, where you're really reducing your demand by 85 to 90, 80 to 90, depends on the building type. Those kind of things, individual things like that, don't, the architects and developers will include them, but you're super insulating your roof anyway, so those kind of things don't have much of an impact. Step 5 really gets you to a very, very efficient building. I actually thought I had a slide, like the next. No, I didn't put it in there.
Okay.
But it gets you very high, but individual things like that don't really make a huge difference.
Yeah, I just, the question of where we want to be on this, I just really struggle with that question, just because I think that question is not for us to decide. We all have opinions on it, but that's really a question for the public, in the sense that the public has to be presented with a series of options that lead to more or less, to moderate, aggressive, whatever label you want to stick on it. And what you're showing, Duncan, is that there are multiple paths to arrive at a net effect on greenhouse gas emissions. So if we took a very aggressive stance from this standpoint, this is, like you said, it's only 11% of the new construction that happens until 2050. And clearly, it has to be coupled with different ways of moving around and different ways of perhaps densifying to change how people can move around. So there's not one single variable that leads to the outcome, right? It's the combination of each variable, and it's the intensity of each variable, that gets implemented. And so that has to be put out as, that has to be the scenario. Like the scenario has to be fundamentally all these variables or varying amounts of each variable that lead you to a total reduction in greenhouse gases, right? Of some percentage. So I can't answer that question when you say, where do we want to be? Well, obviously, I think we probably all want to be as high as we can in terms of the reduction. But ultimately, it's the sum total of all the different approaches. And
I think the question, maybe I didn't phrase one thing, is to be clear, the aggressive one, if you ask 2 lawyers, you would get very different opinions on this, but the second one may not be legal under the current powers. West Vancouver's done it and just decided that they're going to do it, and they're risking, they don't think they're going to get sued, but it's unclear.
Right.
And so we are pushing that. And I think the big discussion for Nanaimo is how much do they want to push the grounds of those things, both in terms of how much money they want to put in versus leaving things up to the province and the federal government.
Sure. But okay, let's say that we pushed this very aggressive stance and the city decided to do this and they took the risk of legal action, whatever it is, but nothing else changed. you know, this would be barely getting us to where we might want to go only for 11% of the new buildings, right? So it's like I said, it's just not one single thing.
Yeah.
I'm trying to put together a package of information related to all these different types of emissions and which variables become critical, so that you can actually then give people a scenario that says, okay, scenario 2 is one where we densify the housing, we try to, you know, somewhat forcefully try to encourage people to change the way they move, because we've built the city or new parts of the city in a way that allows them to access what they need without taking their car halfway across town. And yes, by the way, your new buildings will reach a certain level of efficiency, and perhaps they wouldn't have natural gas, right? Like, it's that totality of things that ends up with where you get, you know, a reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Because one single variable changed or maximized turned up to 11 versus all the others not changed at all, it doesn't lead us where we want to go. Like you said, you made that point right up the front, at the start, right up front. So I don't know where we want to go. I would love to see the scenarios that shows us the most aggressive scenario to get to these emissions reductions would require X, Y, Z. Super dense cities, complete mode shifts in terms of how people move, super efficient buildings, and no natural gas. That's what you need to get to these targets by 2050, right? At least you know what you need to do, right? And if you don't do that, you end up 10% short, 15% short of your targets, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I mean, this is super informative, and I really appreciate it, because we've never seen this kind of layout of how these things work, you know. But I'm sort of like I'm just pausing for the cake at the end of all the ingredients.
Yeah. So we are planning on coming back with what I think you're asking for. This is, to me, is just a direction, and I've worked with many communities, and not everyone is as far over on as you guys are expressing to me right now. So just to be clear, this isn't necessarily a done deal for everyone in BC. So this actually is very useful feedback, but I will be coming back with what you're asking, Jerome.
Yeah, and I think, you know, having looked at the slides, you know, this presentation is going to go through, you know, all the different categories of greenhouse gas emissions, you know, from our community, with policies that will range from the status quo to the as best as you can do, but still inadequate scale. And I think, you know, this committee is a bit of a focus group to provide feedback on, you know, what are we going to be presenting to the community, and sort of where we want to go. So, you know, as we go through each one, we feedback, and then, you know, as Jerome stated, we'll by then we'll have a big picture of what we can do, and you know, can provide feedback then. For myself, I definitely think that, you know, from those slides, just seeing, you know, how far efficiency can get you, it's not very far, and that we need to, you know, really support fuel switching. And I like this idea of having two choices, you know, the expensive step 5 requirement that actually doesn't really do a whole lot compared, or being able to just put in the current technology that's electric with the heat pumps and you know, have an immediate reduction in your buildings, new buildings, greenhouse gas production. So I like the approach that West Vancouver's taking. Any other more comments on this section? Okay.
So here's my slide that I was talking about. This just shows the light blue, the dark blue shows the alternative versus, even as you move down the steps, if you're staying with natural gas, you're still not getting the same amounts. And so you can get your GHG reductions without getting efficiency. Anyway, that was the comment that Ben just made. Next slide. So again, now getting into retrofits, this is where it starts to get hard. I would argue the 11%, that's a pretty significant, if we can get all that, that's great. So this is where it's going to be tough. So 65% of existing building stock will still exist in 2050. Current trends see actually going backwards, that people who have electric baseboards are upgrading and replacing by natural gas, and actually increasing GHG emissions, not going the other direction. I hope that the heat wave might convince more people to look into heat pumps, because they if you can turn them on for 3 or 4 days a year and get air conditioning, that's a benefit. But you still get a massive reduction in GHGs, but the current trend is not in the right direction. This is difficult for local governments because you don't have a lot of power around this. There is talk of a retrofit code coming in. I've heard 2027, 26, but I've also been hearing this for 10 years. And to meet your 2030 targets, 25% of your housing units need to have a fossil fuel system replaced with zero carbon. So you divide that out by 9 years left, you're probably looking at 2 to 3% of units, which is pretty substantial to replace them, and not replace them with a more efficient furnace, but with a zero carbon system. Next slide. So again, this is the current policies. Currently, you guys are topping up a bit better homes for BC grants by $350, $500 extra for the heat for electrical upgrade if you need to. Most people are waiting for this retrofit code. Other communities are topping up that by quite a bit. City of Vancouver does heat pump upgrades if you're moving from fossil fuel by $6,000 to the top up, and combined with the provincial money, that gets you. It's basically a complete no-brainer. You would not choose a natural gas unless you were adamant that you wanted natural gas, because it's actually cheaper once you get up to that $6,000 top up. Other options are targeting, these incentives to low-income homes and/or oil heat. Exploring, I know other communities are looking at heating permits. So whenever you change out your heating system, you have to get a permit. They can't say you can't do natural gas, but they can use that as a time to have a staff member who can educate and talk you through why that might not be a good idea to put in a natural gas furnace. Right now, Fortis is using an awful lot of money to advertise the benefits of switching to natural gas. So that, and I ran the quick back of the envelope numbers to hit the moderate one, which we see getting there in terms of seeing adoption. Still not as high as in Vancouver, where it's a no-brainer. Everyone's putting them in whenever they can. They also have more powers, so I got to be careful. They do have more powers to regulate than you do because of the Vancouver Charter. But a $2,000 increase would be about a $20 million to you between now and 2030. And you would start getting that towards that. $6,000 would be $60 million. So that's, $60 million over 10 years, 9 years, $6 million a year, which is a fairly substantial if you wanted to hit your targets. But that's the kind of order of magnitude that we're talking about here. Again, the province is switching with their incentives as well, so you have to make sure you're playing with that. But that's kind of where we need to be if we want to see it. And we're really seeing in Vancouver, once they reach these numbers of incentives, there's a real tipping point that's happening. So I just want to open that up. I mean, if the same comments are, we just want to stay on the aggressive side, that's great. I'm kind of getting that message from everybody. But other comments would also be useful.
Elise. Go ahead, Elise.
Those costs that you were budgeting, is that only for that small percentage within the city of Nanaimo?
That's within the city of Nanaimo upgrading.
Did you say 2 to 3% of homes, if I remember correctly, or?
No, that would be 25% of homes by 2% a year.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. So 25% of homes would bring us to the moderate point.
Would get you to your 2030 target of a 50% reduction from existing buildings.
That's all.
Seen any other comments? Really quickly, I'll comment. I think, obviously try to do whatever we can to what we can afford. And it would be interesting, if we had a limited time, $26,000 top-ups or $46,000 top-ups, and then you know, if you get in and then it decreases over time, so that we kind of incentivize a rush while there's good opportunity, and could be an interesting communications marketing strategy.
There's also building capacity. I mean, right now in Victoria, they've lowered the province has lowered some incentives because contractors can't physically install them fast enough. So that there needs to be some time and a direction to get your building and your HVAC professionals ready to do this as well. So it's not as simple as I'm presenting it here, but this is the broad picture of it. Yeah.
Excellent. Go ahead.
On to next slide, or for?
Yeah.
So here we're going to start talking about transportation, and a drop in business as usual transportations that you see there really comes from electrical vehicle mandate, the electric vehicle mandate that's BC has put in. The feds are now talking about accelerating that a little bit even, but that's the default now, is to move most of our vehicle fleet to electric. Well, zero emissions, but it's likely to be electric by 2040. No new vehicles in BC will be allowed to be sold. Light duty vehicles will be allowed to be sold. Next slide. So here's where it gets complicated. My doctorate was in transportation modeling, and it's really hard to say for sure what is going to happen. All three scenarios builds on the densification, mixing use, mixing destinations with homes, whether it be for work or for shopping. And the scenario 2 and 3 turn it up slightly, but they're not huge differences between them. The real thing that happens is you know, you can put density in different places, but if you don't build the urban environment, the bike routes, the pedestrian areas, the pedestrian walkways, you're not going to get these shifts that we're talking about. So really, at the high level scenarios, the difference between them, again, because of the fact that the mass majority of your people, of your residents and jobs are still going to be where they are now. We're seeing a 10,000 unit increase, but that's not the majority, or even the close to the majority of people. So you're going to see a shift in all three, but you're not going to see a radical change in all of them.
Elise.
Hi. Okay. It's too tiny to see on this slide, but on the previous slides of these larger images, I noticed that the farther Snuneymuxw First Nation plot of land, it wasn't connected with anything. And I don't know what the population is for there, but I'm just curious as to why there's no connection to that. Thank you.
I'll try and answer that. I fixed my mic. I think it should be better. The Snuneymuxw First Nation has its reserves as well as other land holdings, and there is sensitivity, of course, that the Snuneymuxw wish to be the masters of their future, although Nanaimo will service them with utilities and of course transportation connections. And so there aren't specific proposals made related to Snuneymuxw interests, but there certainly is, you know, ongoing dialogue generally, and for instance, at Vancouver Island University, there is a holding beside that, and there's an anticipation that that would be a part of an urban node or town center. But we would not be so bold as to make assumptions and map things related to First Nations. So we want to respect them and involve them, but it is theirs to determine what will be on a map.
So will the scenarios be consulted with Snuneymuxw First Nation?
Lisa, do you want to comment on that? You're still here?
Yes, I am. Hi, Leeds, through Ben, Councillor Gaspar. Yes, that is the response to that. I think you're looking at the reserve out in Cedar.
You have to like the one closer towards Chase River. It's hard to see on these.
Yes, that's right. And that is, Snuneymuxw has a limited amount of land, and that is where they see a lot of their, some of their future housing going compared to where they currently have land. And then they may be getting more as, or they will be getting more, as David's alluded to, in the VIU area. So that's within the city. But yeah, their own lands and their plans, we are sharing our information with them and seeing what their input is around that.
I should clarify too, the schematics that you're seeing here, the lines connecting would be major transit routes and the like. So we're not showing the secondary and tertiary routes, which would tend to connect the lower density areas like this Nanaimo. So these are just to show the main thoroughfares with an emphasis on transit. Back to the chair.
Go ahead.
Okay, next slide. So the current transportation plan, which is going to be embedded in this, shows an increase, a doubling of trips by walking, biking, and transit. And draft targets a reduction in distance driven by 29% per person, which is pretty substantial. And those targets would result in a GHG reduction of 17% by 2050, somewhat offset by the fact that if you're taking away from electric vehicle trip, you're not going to really have much of a difference. But 17% reduction by your transportation plan targets is substantial. And okay, next. Actually, what I was going to say in the last slide was just that even if we're trading off between electric vehicles and active transportation, there are obviously a lot of other benefits of equity and health and community co-benefits to active transportation that don't get captured in GHGs, whether that be allowing people who can't drive, whether that be to get around, health reasons for active transportation. There's a lot of other reasons to do it. It gets a little muddy when you're starting to electrify the entire vehicle fleet. And so just talking a little bit what that looks like is, continuing to implement your transportation plan, incremental pedestrian and cycling improvements, reduce parking requirements for new construction and car share, which is typically what municipalities are doing. But we can also see what's happening down here in Victoria, where Victoria has built out an entire all ages and ability cycling network within 6, and it can be complete in 7 years, where they're starting to invest in, they're spending $500,000 this year alone on end of trip bike facilities to really increase the numbers. And they've got a real problem here with bike theft. So that's one of the things they're trying to deal with. And really changing away your signals are prioritized for transit and other use over vehicles. As we start moving into more aggressive forms of what you can do is, actively reallocating your road space from parking to active transportation. This is more of a European example, but dedicate road space for transit, ensuring that transit is faster than a private vehicle at all. There are cities in Europe that have that as their goal, and they make sure that every buses don't stop at a traffic light. And that is something that is within your purview as the city. Edmonton just removed their parking minimums. So there is no requirement for parking on buildings, which is a huge shift in North America. Has happened in Europe, but those are the kind of things that force people. I know that the studies have shown that the single biggest decision single biggest thing that drives people's decisions to reduce their total kilometers driven is how many vehicles they own. So going from 2 vehicles to 1 vehicle per household is a huge jump, and 1 to 0 makes a huge one, even if you have car shares and taxis and Ubers and other things. Not having a vehicle is the single biggest thing you can do. So this is really where starting to be radical, particularly from the perspective of Nanaimo's past, is where you can really start to see change and you can really accelerate this quickly. A lot of these changes take time. We talk a lot about Copenhagen and Amsterdam, and where they are now, it's really important to remember that they started this in the shifts in 1970s. So there is no evidence of anywhere making these kinds of shifts by the 2030 time horizon that you're talking about in 9 years. These are really things that have happened in other places over a 30 or 40-year time horizon, which is this 2050 time horizon. Not to say it couldn't be done, but there aren't examples that I know of that show those kind of shifts. I don't know if there's any questions or comments on this.
How much sorry, Ben, go ahead.
No, you're on.
I'm just curious in the scenarios of the mobility hubs, for example, using that terminology, is this sort of a format that allows this aggressive approach? I guess I'm trying to straddle can you implement areas in a city, or is that feasible to think that you could have a mix of all these things together, but that between what you term to be mobility hubs, you would have, let's call it rapid transit with buses, dedicated lanes, and minimal stops or something like that, right? Just for connectivity, because, I'd never heard that, Duncan, before, but it makes total sense that, the number of vehicles you own is the prime indicator of how much you drive, which, seems kind of intuitive. But if you can increase the efficiency of transit, then that's arguably, I don't think that's a radically aggressive stance, but it's an interesting one to say, can we make, connectivity for these scenarios that are presented, these hubs, something, a priority effectively, right?
So it's important to remember that even if you get everyone doing the most of their daily needs and commutes on transit, they're still going to drive to Duncan or to Campbell River or other places. So you're never going to get 100% from that, and there's a bit of a fallacy to expect that you're going to. I would say that scenarios 2 and 3 get you a little farther in that direction, but all 3 of them could work. Like we really did try not to make them that different. It's not like one that's better than everything else. All 3 of them could be done. It's probably a little easier with the central one. But again, you're going to capture those people who live in the downtown are going to be the ones who are zero car or less likely to have a vehicle, whereas everybody else, it's going to be harder for them because they're not in that downtown core. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
To input, scenario 2 is the one that has an urban node or town center that corresponds to each of the mobility hubs. And so that is trying to get that match between mixed use and density and walking neighborhoods, so that more of the city has that opportunity to not need a vehicle or as many of them. That's one of the reasons that scenario 2 is what it is.
Right. Thank you.
I'm just wondering if I could ask a question that actually of Duncan and Dave, and it's around the fact that we've inherited a land use pattern that is quite linear as Nanaimo went from a central to this longer piece. And the reality that growing by an estimated 40,000 people in the next 25 years still leaves us as a very modest sized city where it's still quite challenging to achieve the densities that we need. And I think that, Duncan, that's some of the pieces you've been saying. Like one of the things that would be radical is to change our boundaries, but we can't do that. And that would be a politically impossible task. And so those thresholds for density and transit, and also I would say that, Duncan, one of the things, and Dave, that I've heard is that if it's still convenient for people to drive, so they can afford the fuel, parking is accessible and cheap, that even as you provide the density, they're still going to choose driving short distances if it's convenient to park. You have to make it almost, I don't know if you've got some thoughts around that.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the research does show that as well. Again, that's where you get in this, if you don't have a vehicle, you can't make that choice. But restricting parking is a pretty radical thing in terms of making parking, and there's, yeah, so if it's difficult to park, you've got to make it easier to these other modes have to be difficult. And that's where reducing parking minimums has a benefit in reducing housing costs, but also makes it harder for someone to come in and park. when they're running for shops, or the bigger the parking lot you have, the more spaces you have, the easier it is. So it's trying to find that sweet spot between being accessible to your community, because are some people who need to drive, but then without making it too easy. And that's other cities. There's lots of European examples where they've limited the amount of parking. Vancouver right now, in their big greenest city plan right now, is talking about putting on-street parking charges. So that's pretty radical for BC. But so that even residents, if they want to park on their street, on the public street, have to pay a yearly fee.
It's less if it's a low emissions vehicle.
Yeah.
I wanted to reemphasize Duncan's point earlier too, that the other side of it is to move people away from driving everywhere. The facilities to bicycle or to walk have to be there. So he told me a nice story about Burnaby, where you can have lots of density, but until they actually started addressing their streets and produce the linkages, they didn't see the shift. Whereas once they did, it started to happen. So it's both the opportunity to be active as well as less convenience for a car.
Go on.
Keep going. Okay, next slide. So electric vehicles, I want to talk a little bit about that, is right now, as of December 2020, you have 0.9% of your vehicles in Nanaimo are electric vehicles. Surprisingly, a larger number of vehicles that are registered commercially are EVs than I was expecting. Not quite the same percentage, but higher than I've seen other places. And despite this mandate to have 30% of EV sales by 2030, or zero emission vehicles, due to vehicle turnover times, you're really only going to get 12% of your vehicles by 2030, unless we find some way to make this go quicker. The average vehicle on the road is about 15.6 years. And they keep getting handed down to different people as they move through. So it's difficult to get a 30% reduction by 2030, even if every single vehicle that's being sold in 2030, or 30% of them, are EV sales. I believe on the island, concentrated mostly in the capital region, 9 or 10% of vehicles in 2020 were sold or EVs, way above the target. I don't think it's as high in Nanaimo as it is down South Island. But a reminder also that 80% of transportation emissions are from personal vehicles. It's a little bit gray to figure out what's a personal vehicle, what's not, but it's kind of a weight class, an F350 and above, which are not always commercial vehicles. But that's kind of but the vast majority of it are vehicles that are registered personally, not commercially, and we can see that in the data. So there's a tendency sometimes to think, well, if we just get all the big trucks and delivery trucks and construction vehicles off the road, that'll do it. It's not true. The vast majority of it is for personal trips. Next slide. So looking at policy, currently you require EV charging infrastructure for 10% and 30% electrified, so it's possible, of parking stalls in new multifamily. Currently, most municipalities are slowly increasing their public charging infrastructure. You guys actually have a pretty good public charging infrastructure relative to other places in the island and in BC. I drive an EV, so I'm acutely aware when I go visit my relatives up in Qualicum that I was pretty well served. But starting to push that is, how are we going to help people make that transition? Other municipalities have started moving to 100% stalls in new construction, and people are starting to talk about targeting EVs charging in areas with existing multifamily buildings. Converting a single family home and even townhouses to give you the charging infrastructure is really easy. And so that really shouldn't be worried about too much. It's really targeting the people who live in apartments and condos that already exist that don't have the infrastructure. It is prohibitively expensive to retrofit those buildings. So looking at ways in which to put your parking infrastructure near people where they live, such that when they do decide to change a car, and invest in an EV, they know that there's a parking space for them that they can charge. And those buildings, multifamily buildings, are really the difficult place for them because it's very expensive to retrofit. They just don't have the electrical capacity to the building to charge vehicles. And then as you start to move towards the aggressive, Vancouver, as David mentioned, is providing parking incentives for EVs. Victoria is adding level 3 chargers to street parking in the downtown. They're putting it out on street park, really spreading it everywhere. And while you can't mandate that someone buys an EV, it's certainly making it easier. All the research shows that if people know that there's a parking space near them, that they don't see busy all the time. This is where it's a little bit counterintuitive, where we like to see, well, no one's using the spot, so therefore it's a problem. Actually, having them not being used actually encourages people to buy more vehicles because they know they can charge. If they see them fully full, that actually is a disincentive. So it's this weird thing where we need to work on that. So this is where we're trying to, how we can push electric vehicles, whether or not we want to provide incentives, but also maybe sticks if you want to provide more free parking for electric vehicles and charge or have no parking for non-electric vehicles. Off the scale here on aggressive. Comments on that?
Just in terms of multifamily retrofits, that's something that is relatively, and maybe that's a staff, that's something relatively easy that we can do. And I'm just curious, is there a huge cost increase for developers to just do it when you're building the building, or is it not really, that prohibitive if you're doing it during construction?
For new construction, the kind of moderate there, the incremental costs are in the order of $500 to $1,000 per stall and going down. And in those places that have done it, they've had almost zero pushback because most of the higher end developers are doing it anyway because it's a sales feature.
Great, thanks.
Please, I think has a question.
I have another question, yeah. I'm just wondering about the equity for making it easier to park in those electric vehicle stalls, but what about the people who not necessarily have the means to purchase electric vehicles and have that more accessible?
That's definitely a concern. And this is, and all of these things, there have to be an equity decision. And it is with all of these things that we're talking about, a lot of the programs, the incentives for heat pump upgrades and EV adoption, really, when you look at the numbers, target people who at the higher end of the income spectrum right now, because that's who are the ones who are buying. So there are people looking in Halifax, a few places. I've worked with a group here looking at energy poverty, really trying to figure out a way to change that target. But the reality is for the next, until there's a lot of used EVs on the market, that's unfortunately going to be there. I would argue that targeting charging stations around multifamily homes that may or may not be higher income gets you there a lot quicker, but not in the next 3 to 4 years. I think the equity issue is always going to be there.
Thank you, Wally.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it may not be that easy to retrofit. I live in a large condo downtown with 120 suites. We just had a complete review of our electrical system. The wiring in the building and the capability of the equipment would be inadequate to do the level 3 charger, and there's a question whether we could even do the level 2.
And that's what I was actually saying. I maybe with Ben, we got our wires crossed. Is that it's very easy for new construction, but all condo buildings that are there already that don't have it. My understanding is forget it. It's not even worth it. It's just sometimes it's physically impossible, and other times it's in the tens of thousands of dollars per stall.
Well, it's also, you can't take it out of the reserve fund study because the Strata Property Act allows you only to do existing things. If you want to add new resources or new capacity to the building, it's on special assessment. To get a special assessment through, you got to have a 3/4 vote of the owners. So not going to be easy to do it. And so there's technical issues and there's people issues and financial issues. So The retrofit isn't that easy. It sounds good, but it's not going to come easily.
Great. Not seeing any other comments, so go ahead, Duncan.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So solid waste, business as usual. It's about 5% of your GHGs in 2017. It moves up over time, largely due to population growth and because your other things are going down, so it becomes a larger part of the wedge. And if we go to the next slide, the key driver of GHGs from waste is decomposition of organic matter in your landfill, and diversion to composting, or obviously reducing the amount that's going in the first place. But methane capture are the main solutions. Next slide. Actually, reading your policies, this is not my level of expertise, but I've read a lot of these reports. You guys are actually fairly, I would put yourselves in the moderate already on this one, in terms of your actual numbers of what's being captured in your landfill and your targets. But really focusing on organics diversion is really important to reduce that. It's 40% of your waste in 2012. There's a new study going in this year, so you'll actually know more what's going into your landfill, is compostable material and paper, which is pretty high in 2012. And all of that decomposes anaerobically if it's not captured, and becomes methane, which has a big GHG impact. So that you've already got policies in place to reduce that. It's probably much lower than that by now. But keeping on that, looking at other policies. Victoria has moved to requiring deconstruction of buildings instead of landfilling, which adds about $10,000, $10,000 to $20,000 per building, per unit, where they require you to take apart your buildings and recycle everything so it doesn't go into landfill. Because plywood and all kinds of wood materials are still going to decompose. They're hard to use and hard to reuse, but they do provide it. If you just throw them in the landfill, which is typical, it does do that. And again, continuing your policies to aggressively reduce your matter going to landfill. Other communities are looking at waste to energy, which is a bad word in some communities. I believe it in your policies. We will not do this. Because it has people conflate it with incineration, which is partially true, but it is considered a way of getting energy from materials that would otherwise compost. Again, it's a 5% of your emissions, so whether it's worth doing something that would cause that much political uproar may not be worth it, but it is something there to think about.
Any comments? I've got a couple questions, just on the, I guess sort of how we're calculating GHGs, and we kind of have the, our corporate emissions, then we have our community emissions, and then there's sort of embodied emissions in consumption that doesn't really get calculated. In terms of the building deconstruction and being able to reuse some of those materials and being able to source separate more effectively, this is something that Victoria has gone down and something that I've been quite interested in. And I was just wondering, I guess maybe this is a question for Mr. Sims, what would be the feasibility of instituting something like this here in Nanaimo? Is that something that we could do within our current resources, or require, additional staff to manage something like that?
Mr. Chair, I'd love to give you an answer. I really don't have one. I think it's certainly on our radar, and but I think it's worth pursuing a little bit, and it's going to be that next step. But I don't have the knowledge of it at my fingertips, what it would take to do.
Okay, and I think building on that, just we're participating in the Circular Cities initiative, where there's going to be some sharing of knowledge around circular economy and zero waste in that, and I'm curious, it might be good timing, as we're participating in that, to build a bit of a circular economy zero waste strategy, so that we do have, a bit of a pathway of how we can leverage our municipal powers, which are a little bit more than the regional districts, to sort of complement what's happening at the regional district level and do what we can to address, the GHGs that are associated with material use.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that forward, because I think that is exactly what will help build that knowledge base.
So Ben, just to one thing, just as we, it always comes up, the embodied emissions, and so Saanich is one of the few places that's actually done an analysis of that, and I worked with them on this years back. And when you start to include consumption and embodied emissions, it's very coarse. They're only increasing their emissions by 20%. So doing the math, it's about 80% or 75% is still this part that we're talking about, and focusing on that really only gets you an additional 20%. It's big, but it doesn't overwhelm the amount. We waste so much by burning for vehicles and for heating that it does dwarf the consumption-based emissions. But it's very hard to quantify and very hard to do. So that's their best guess.
Great. That'd be interesting to look at that.
I can forward that or send you the links about that.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, next slide. I think we're almost done, actually. So what we're going to be doing in the fall, and we haven't really, the project team with the city and the consultants haven't really figured out who's going to be invited or how we're going to do this. But this is really where we're going to try and put together that picture of what that looks like. And thankfully, it looks like we'll be able to do this in person. And really looking at what a scenario is to reach our targets and what are the actual policies. So we're putting a plan together on that. And one of the questions, whether or not you would be included in that as a stakeholder group, or how best. I mean, really, basically what I've heard today is you are definitely on the aggressive side of the community. And it's really important in these kind of discussions. This is purely my professional opinion from having done this in many groups. It's really important to move the rest of the community along into these stakeholder discussions, where they can start to come up to the same conclusions that you have already come to, it sounds like, in this committee, that they're more important in a way to engage, simply because they have a lot more learning to do. But that's the plan, and we're planning on doing more modeling based on your input today. It kind of gives me a much better sense of where I can push, or where I should be pushing the modeling. If everyone said, keep us, we want to be very, very moderate, we don't want to do anything that costs us money, or we don't want to do anything that that pushes the boundary of what's going on, that's a different set of policies. So this kind of helps me figure out where the middle point of what I'm going to be presenting will be. Next slide, I think that's it.
Thank you, Duncan. Yes, we're with the chair, we're moving into the final agenda item, the last two, which were to get us thinking and ready for the September meeting of this committee. We made a judgment call looking at the agenda that the greenhouse gas topic needed the entire workshop today, and that was correct. So I'm glad for the discussion and the time to go through it in the detail that's been done. So climate mitigation and greenhouse gas targets and trends was today. The rest that's on this slide are the things that are still to talk about, and there are many. So there's the adaptation part of climate change, increased flooding, greater rainfall intensity, droughts and heat, like we've been seeing recently, and secondary things like slope stability, of course, sea level rise. So we want to talk about that. We want to talk about water quality and quantity and watershed management. We definitely want to talk about habitat and biodiversity, both conserving it and restoring it where it's damaged. And then there's the urban forest, our vegetation cover, urban agriculture, which is increasing interest for people, especially living in higher density. And then integrating options. An example that I was just thinking of a minute ago when you were talking about the circular economy. We've been working a lot at Metro Vancouver, and one of the things there that they're doing for stormwater management is to rebuild the sponge. And so vegetation is a part of it, but it's mostly soil. And so instead of having a skim of grass that's this deep, can we have deeper soils that are enough to absorb the runoff from a roof or from a road and store it slowly? That relatively simple thing means actually less irrigation, less water use, better plant growth. And by the way, taking our organics, which are composted now, and using them in mixed with sand and to create those soils. So by definition, circular. So we're looking at integrated options like that. So lots of benefits for single actions. So we are proposing to do that in a similar way to what Duncan has done today, where we'll have a little bit of background information, but also then what the city's doing now, what would be moderate and the best we can do options to talk about on each of these subjects. To get prepared for that, I encourage you to look back to the slides that were presented back in October to the Environment Committee. There's a ton of links and information there that's background, as well as lists of the next steps that NIMO could do, and we'll be pulling some of that information forward. I'd also encourage you to, if you want to get your heads really into climate adaptation, to review the BC Adapts. If you just go online and search for BC Adapts, you'll see a video series, and it covers sea level rise and rainwater management and rainwater reuse. And so that's also very useful and easy to see. Backgrounders has stars Bill Sims, so you'll want to watch that, and a lot of other local government folks. And then I wanted to allow Lisa to wrap up here with a little bit of information about phase 2 of Reimagine the NIMO, and how you are strongly encouraged to both review the information online and take part in that. Lisa, would you like to carry through?
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Duncan. I want to give a huge props to Lanark for preparing some really diverse ways of engaging the community. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have surveys in the foundations, which is basically the Nanaimo Donut, giving people a chance to learn more about it and to provide feedback and on the goals that are based on that, and then the targets and indicators. And then exploring the scenarios is that really key piece. We've given you a high-level overview today of the 3 different scenarios, and we can, I think maybe one of you may have already signed up for one of the workshops. I'm not sure if I recognize, I think I saw maybe one of your names. So we have a series of workshops where people can spend up to 2 hours with us, giving their feedback on the process and on the different scenarios, and having an in-depth discussion with ourselves and also Janet Zielinski from Lanark. Wonder if you can go to the next slide, please, Dave. Thank you. So, and actually I think I can skip that slide and go to the last slide. And I think what is really key and exciting, if you can go to the next slide, Dave, is that we've provided the workshop series. We provide an opportunity for somebody to do a self-guided workshop based on a test we did with some staff who are totally unrelated to this project. We've done a lot more videos explaining the scenarios, explaining the goals and indicators. And I also want to highlight something called the Metroquest Platform. And through Lanark, we have access to this very cool software that allows us to play with where people would like to see different building forms, different types of land uses, and zoom into different parts of the city. So for example, where would people support seeing higher density of a certain type, a certain building form, say buildings over 6 stories, and they're given a range of options. Where would people support different types of amenities? And it's a very cool platform to play around with and record your input. So we'd ask the Environment Committee to take the time to go online and engage through the online platform, sign up for a workshop. We have the opportunity, if there's something customized you'd like us to do for you, we can offer that as well. And also for you to promote this amongst your networks. Duncan's mentioned the need to build, or the to educate and inform people about these scenarios and choices. And the way it's set up, it gives the pros and cons, and it actually allows you to pick what are some of your priorities. And as you pick those priorities, it then measures how well each scenario works towards those priorities. So I don't have the link with me right now to show you, and I think we're a little bit short on time, but it's something we could do for you at the next meeting, but I would encourage you to play with it yourselves. So hopefully that's enough of an incentive. You're a very motivated group. And for Lisa Frey's benefit, I will let you know, Lisa used to be a principal at Departure Bay Eco School, and we have been engaging elementary students through art with the hope of also engaging their parents and informing them about this process, getting them involved. So we've had, I think, over 600 elementary school students participate, 27 classes. We've had 3 high school classes so far, and looking at more in the future, engaging in this work. So that's a wrap from me. And any final words, Dave and Duncan?
I just am looking forward to working with this group again in September, and might see some of you in the engagement between now and then. I'll remind you that Duncan is preparing to do more modeling in the vein of what you were requesting. What is the mix of these tools to get to targets? That is very much in our mindset. And finally, the visualizations we're talking about of a typical neighborhood and a typical town center and corridor will I hope be useful to even the materials for that to take a look as examples in the early fall. So, it would be fun to sit down with the town center and say, okay, how do we actually apply these principles to meet our targets? What would it mean in terms of an example? So we're continuing to be excited and so happy for the level of engagement that we're seeing. We do expect a bit less engagement in this options phase 2 because it's relatively complex. A little less than we had wonderful engagement in phase 1. We expect a little less in phase 2, but maybe you can fix that. And by working with your networks. And so with that, thank you, Duncan and Lisa, and back to the chair. And we hope to work with you going ahead. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So any final comments from the committee members just on the presentation, and any final feedback they'd like to give Duncan and David? And we have about 7 minutes left, so keep it succinct. I see Jerome.
First, just a big thanks to both of you. That was really interesting and informative, and it's sort of the real sort of substantive information that I think gets us to realize how complex it is, but also sort of helps us think about some of the options. I have another question that's really for Lisa, but Duncan and David may well be able to answer as well. I'm curious about the priorities that you've set up in this 5-step, the scenarios. Where do those come from? And I'm asking only because I find that many of them are overlapping, and I'm also wondering how they're sort of so broad. I'm just wondering what the source of those specific 10s is.
Okay, so those were drawn from the phase 1 feedback that we got. Yeah. And now some of the feedback granted were things that were less applicable to a land use scenario.
Yeah.
So what we did is we took the feedback from phase 1 and then use that to give the choice. Now, one of the questions council asked was, could you add one? And unfortunately, the way the software works, you have to pre-program it with the indicator that you're using. So it's not an exact science, Jerome, but it gives people an overall sense of how to interact with the pros and cons and what happens. Your priority might be more affordable housing, and density in one area, but what does that do? What's the trade-off if you go from one scenario over another on your GHGs? So we thought a good kind of compromise to make it accessible without being overly complex, but it's not as interactive as if you could go in and say, you know what, I want to add a few more here, because then we would have to do the technical work on the fly. I think as we get more technology in the future, we'd be able to do that more interactively. And I think the concept that Councillor Gasparak had with dashboards, and in the future, we would literally be able to plug and play. What impact does this building have, this density, this proposal here on these different factors? Does that help?
Okay. Yeah, it does in a way. I mean, I think it's trying to straddle many things. I was sort of playing around with this, and I said, okay, I'm the type of person who wants housing diversity, supportive social services, affordability, and then, I mean, I could basically pick things that have nothing to do with transportation, have everything to do with where the city decides to build its services. And in that sense, it exists independently of any of the scenarios. I mean, it can fit into any of these scenarios. It can be completely left out of any of these scenarios, right? So I was trying to understand how you were using this tool or this information, either to reinforce some of the decisions that are being made, I guess, by Lanark as you're sort of building these plans, or if it's something that you're really trying to, I don't know. That's what I was trying to figure out, how you're using it. I was curious.
Yeah, and Dave, I'm wondering, because really Jana did build this for us, so I'm giving my interpretation of what she's been able to do for us.
I wanted to comment. The scenarios are illustrations. They're that, as you've come to realize and knew before, this is a very, very complex duck soup, right? It is extraordinarily complex, and everything's related to everything else in terms of all the indicators, greenhouse gas being one of them. We struggle with how to boil that down into something that's accessible, that the general public can helpfully review and comment on, while recognizing that we don't want to simplify so much that we're unrealistic. And so the scenarios are snapshots of there's different approaches to consider. They try and bring a lot of variant elements together in one scenario, but honestly, how they'll be used, we don't expect that any of the scenarios will be chosen wholesale. There will be a different set of choices for greenhouse gases or for biodiversity or for X, Y, and Z. The scenarios are a way to help people have that dialogue, but no more than that. So in a sense, there is a scenario 4, but it's the one that will come towards phase 3 because it'll be based on what people say about the 3 that are in front of them. I'll maybe stop there, but it is a dance of simple enough to be understandable. I was going to add that actually it's committees like this that we and other stakeholder workshops where we really want to delve into the detail and deal with the details because it's more effective face-to-face and taking more time. So a lot of the general public might only want to spend 15 minutes on this. Obviously, people like yourselves will spend hours and days, and so we'll be working with each of those groups. Thanks.
Although, Dave, I will say our first workshop, which is tomorrow, is full. So we're seeing a very impressive uptake of people willing to spend 2 hours with us.
Yes,
to go through
which is great.
Depth. And I think that the key thing is people understanding the trade-offs, because that ultimately is what our councillors will be faced with, is how we want to advance on so many different pieces, both social, environmental, economic, all the elements of our Nanaimo donut. But there's going to be some trade-offs. There'll be some things that we can advance together, environmentally and socially, and there'll be some that. So I hope we've done a pretty decent job of giving people a range of ways to gain feedback, and we'll kind of see as it unfolds.
Thanks, Lisa. And as you think through this, there's also the element of time. So there's a lot of cases where the city's in a certain place now. How fast do you move to moderate? How fast do you move to aggressive? How fast do you move beyond that over 25 years? This is a 25-year outlook, and so the pacing of change and which emphasis are first and which are middle and which are later in the time span is another level of complexity, but very much a part of this. Back to the chair.
Great. Any other final comments? Well, I really appreciate the presentation and the work that's gone into this so far. It was great to sort of see the direction things are going. I've got one comment, just in communication out to the public on the level of effort, the framing of that, and I think it's really important to see this as an opportunity for education as well for the community, and to lead with goals. To that there are some clear international goals and temperatures that we're trying to hit, and to do our part, what we have to do to do our level best and do our share. And I think it's clear that whatever we do is probably going to be underneath, unless we see some greater movement at the provincial and federal level. But I really hope that communication does get out to the public, so that everyone can understand sort of what we're having to approach here. So yeah, without not seeing any other hands up for comments, so just to the committee members as well, this is an opportunity for the public to provide feedback on the phase 2, and it's important and that feedback does get used. So please forward on to your networks, through Facebook and other means, to go and use the engagement tools that the city is providing, and to click the aggressive button. Oh no, wait a minute. The best that we can do and still fall short. So yeah, I guess now it's just for a motion of adjournment. Moved by Councillor Brown, Tyler, seconded by, I can't see everybody's photo, Elise. All in favor? Committee adjourned. Right on. Well, enjoy the sun. Hope folks are getting out swimming.